The call came on a Tuesday in October 2008. A loan officer I'd worked with for 11 years. His voice doing that specific, careful thing bankers do when they're about to tell you something they genuinely hate telling you. A tone I'd come to recognize instantly, even before he finished his first full sentence. The bank was calling the note on my last 2 spec homes, both sitting finished and unsold in a Phoenix subdivision that had gone from a 6-month waiting list to a ghost town in less than a year. And because I'd personally guaranteed those construction loans the way I always had, the way every small builder does, that call wasn't just the end of my company. It was the end of nearly everything Linda and I had built over 22 years of marriage. I want to walk you through exactly what that collapse cost me, what the next 18 years actually looked like rebuilding from it, and how I finally got the retirement that crash took away from me, just 18 years later than planned. A delay I never once could have imagined sitting in my accountant's office in early 2007. If you're new to this channel, subscribe, because I tell the real, unpolished version of these stories every week. My name is Mark Peterson. I'm 68 years old, and I spent 24 years running my own residential construction company in Phoenix, Arizona, building custom homes and, in the boom years leading up to 2008, a steady stream of spec houses, built on speculation, sold before or shortly after completion. That had made me a genuinely comfortable living through the early 2000s. At our peak, right before it all came apart, I had a crew of 14 working under me, 3 developments going simultaneously, and a retirement plan that, by 2007, projected a comfortable exit at 55, with the business either sold to a younger builder or handed to my son Ryan, who'd been working alongside me since he was 19. I remember specifically, in early 2007, sitting with my accountant and looking at projected numbers that had me and Linda comfortably retired by 55, with a paid-off vacation property near Sedona we'd already started shopping for. The exact kind of confident, forward-looking math that an entire generation of small builders was running that same year. None of us fully understanding how quickly the ground underneath all of it was about to shift. I want to be specific about what actually happened, because I think the general phrase, "lost everything in 2008, undersells the actual mechanics of it for people who haven't lived through owning a small business during a genuine market collapse. The specific way it unfolds not as a single catastrophic event, but as a slow-motion series of phone calls, each one slightly worse than the last. Phoenix had been one of the most overbuilt housing markets in the entire country through the mid-2000s, and when the mortgage crisis hit, the correction there wasn't gradual, it was close to instantaneous. Buyers who'd signed contracts on 4 of my spec homes simply walked away from their deposits rather than close on properties suddenly worth 30% less than their purchase price. Banks that had been eager to lend against rising property values in 2006 froze new lending entirely by early 2008, which meant I couldn't finish 2 nearly complete houses without dipping into personal funds I genuinely didn't have anymore. And because I'd signed personal guarantees on every construction loan for over 2 decades, standard practice for any small builder, the bank's losses on those last 2 unsold houses became my own losses, directly, dollar for dollar, once the foreclosure process ran its course. By early 2009, I'd lost the company entirely, laid off all 14 employees, several of whom had worked for me for over a decade, watched my own home go into a short sale to help cover what the personal guarantees didn't, and sat across a bankruptcy attorney's desk at 50 years old doing math I never once imagined I'd be doing at that stage of my life. Linda and I moved into a rented apartment, The first time either of us had rented anything since our first year of marriage 22 years earlier. And I remember sitting on a second-hand couch that first week watching Ryan, 24 years old and equally out of a job, ask me what we were actually going to do now, and not having an honest answer beyond simply surviving the next month. Linda took that entire stretch harder than she ever fully admitted at the time. And it wasn't until years later, well into our rebuilding, that she told me she'd genuinely wondered, that first winter, whether our marriage would survive watching 22 years of careful building disappear in under a year. We never formally sought counseling, something I sometimes wonder if we should have, but we found our own version of it, mostly through simply refusing to blame each other out loud even on the nights either of us clearly wanted to. I want to comment down below and ask, honestly, how many of you lived through something similar in 2008, whether it was a business, a home, a retirement account? Because I think that particular crash gets discussed in the abstract far more often than people actually talk about what it costs specific families in specific granular detail. The following 18 years were, without exaggeration, the hardest sustained stretch of my working life. Harder in some ways than building the company itself had ever been. Because building something has its own momentum, its own visible progress, while rebuilding from genuine financial ruin at 50 mostly just felt like treading water for years at a stretch. I went to work as a project manager for a larger commercial construction firm, a genuine step down from running my own company, taking orders from supervisors 15 years younger than me who'd never once run a crew of their own, some of whom had clearly heard about my company's collapse and treated me with a specific, careful pity I found harder to stomach some days than the actual pay cut. I did that job for 7 years. Rebuilding credit, rebuilding savings from essentially zero, watching my originally projected retirement age of 55 slide first to 60, then 65, then simply become an open question neither Linda nor I discussed with any real confidence. There were specific low points during those years I still think about. A used truck transmission failing in 2013, that set our slowly rebuilding savings back nearly a full year. A health scare of Linda's in 2016. Nothing ultimately serious, but terrifying in the moment given how thin our insurance coverage had become since losing the company plan. That reminded both of us just how little margin we still had, even 8 years into the recovery. I remembered turning 60 in 2016 and doing the exact math I'd done at 50, at 55, at every milestone since the crash, watching the gap between where I'd have been without 2008 and where I actually stood grow smaller each year but never fully close. Ryan eventually started his own small remodeling business, and I worked alongside him on weekends for extra income throughout my late 50s. The two of us often not speaking about 2008 directly, but both of us, I think, working out something unfinished from that collapse every time we finished a kitchen remodel together. Linda went back to work herself, something she hadn't done since Ryan was small, taking a position as an office manager at a medical practice, and between her income and mine. We spent the better part of a decade simply rebuilding, slowly, the specific unglamorous work of two people in their late 50s and early 60s, doing what should have been done by people 20 years younger, starting over financially from close to nothing. I turned 65 still working, my originally planned retirement now a full decade behind where I'd projected it. And I'll admit that milestone hit me harder than I expected, sitting at a Medicare enrollment appointment doing math on a Social Security statement that, combined with the modest 401k I'd managed to rebuild since 2009, projected a retirement considerably smaller than the one 2008 had taken from me. I remember the specific number on that Social Security statement. reduced permanently from what it would have been had I been able to retire and claim benefits on the original timeline. One more quiet compounding cost of the crash that I hadn't fully accounted for back in 2009, when survival, not long-term optimization, was the only thing either of us had bandwidth to think about. Linda and I ran the numbers seriously for the first time in years that same month. Comfortable enough to stop working entirely in Phoenix, technically, but comfortable in the specific, tight, careful way that leaves very little room for the actual enjoyment retirement is supposed to represent. A house we could barely afford to maintain. A fixed budget that accounted for every single unexpected expense as a genuine crisis rather than a minor inconvenience. The exact same anxious math we'd been running since 2009, just with slightly larger numbers attached to it. Brian, of all people, was the one who first mentioned Mexico seriously, having done several remodeling jobs over the years for clients who'd split their time between Phoenix and various towns along the Mexican coast, one of whom had specifically raved to him about a place called Mazatlan, an old port city on the Pacific, with a genuinely preserved historic center and a cost of living that, once Ryan actually ran the comparison for us on a spreadsheet he built specifically to convince his own stubborn father, showed our modest rebuilt retirement stretching considerably further than it ever would in Arizona. I resisted the idea initially, and I think the resistance had less to do with Mexico itself than with a deeper reluctance I hadn't fully named. A fear that starting over again, even in a good way, might somehow undo the fragile stability Linda and I had spent 18 years rebuilding one careful year at a time. We flew down for a scouting trip 2 years ago, and Mazatlan turned out to be nothing like the resort towns I'd half expected. A genuine working port city with one of the longest oceanfront promenades in the world and a historic center, the Centro Histórico, full of preserved Victorian-era buildings that had clearly been standing, weathering storms and economic downturns of their own, for well over a century. We spent our first 3 days simply walking the neighborhoods, Olas Altas Centro, the quieter residential streets further back from the tourist areas, Linda keeping notes on her phone the way she used to track our monthly budget during the hardest years of the rebuild. And by day 4, we'd already started asking a local real estate agent about properties that needed work, both of us recognizing, without saying it out loud yet, that a renovation project was exactly what this particular chapter of our life actually needed. Walking those streets with a builder's eye, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years, genuinely admiring construction, the specific craftsmanship of buildings that had survived far longer than any spec house I'd ever built, and something about that specific unhurried admiration felt like the first real professional pleasure I'd allowed myself since 2008. We found a small house in the Olas Altas neighborhood, close enough to walk to the Malikan most mornings, needing real renovation work. The kind of project that would have terrified most retirees, but that felt, to a man who'd spent 24 years building homes before spending 18 more rebuilding his own financial foundation, like exactly the right kind of homecoming. We bought it outright, using proceeds from finally selling our Phoenix house the following year. No mortgage, no construction loan, no personal guarantee hanging over my head for the first time in over 3 decades of my adult life. I did most of the renovation work myself over the following 8 months, hiring local tradesmen for the specialized electrical and plumbing work, but handling the carpentry, the tiling, and the general project management personally. The first genuinely hands-on building project I'd done for myself, rather than a client or an employer, since I was in my 30s. The house had been vacant for nearly 4 years before we bought it, Original hardwood floors buried under 3 layers of old linoleum. Plumbing that hadn't been updated since sometime in the 1960s, and a roof that needed full replacement before we could even begin the interior work. And I found a genuine, unfamiliar joy in every one of those problems, each one belonging entirely to me, with no clients changing preferences to accommodate, and no bank inspector scheduling a draw disbursement based on my progress. I want to describe one specific afternoon, about 5 months into that renovation, laying tile in what would become our kitchen, sweating in the Sinaloa heat exactly the way I used to sweat on Phoenix job sites 3 decades earlier, and feeling something shift. A specific recognition that this particular house, unlike every spec home I'd ever built, had no bank attached to it, no buyer who might walk away. No personal guarantee that could wipe out everything Linda and I owned if the market turned against us. It was simply ours, built with my own hands, for no purpose beyond our own life inside it. Linda found her own version of that same feeling in the local expat community, joining a group called Mazatlan International Friends within our first month. A network of mostly American and Canadian retirees who host weekly meetups, and she's since become close with 2 other women, both of whom, it turns out, had their own versions of a 2008 story, a lost pension, a foreclosed house, a business that never recovered. The specific shared history of an entire generation that got knocked backward by that same collapse and spent the following 18 years quietly rebuilding, each in their own city, each assuming they were facing that particular struggle largely alone. One of those women, a retired paralegal from Sacramento named Diane, told Linda during one of their early conversations that she'd never actually said the words "I lost everything" in 2008 out loud to anyone outside her immediate family before that meetup, and that hearing Linda's version of the same broad story felt less like commiseration and more like some kind of overdue permission to finally stop treating the whole thing as a private shame she alone had somehow earned. Linda came home from that particular meetup and cried for the first time in years. Not from sadness exactly, but from the specific relief of finally being fully known by someone outside our own marriage. Ryan visited us this past spring, his first trip down, and I walked him through the finished house room by room. The tile work, the restored original woodwork on the front door we'd saved rather than replaced, the small courtyard garden Linda had built almost entirely herself. He stood in the kitchen for a while, running his hand along the tile edge the way I used to check his own work, when he was learning the trade from me 2 decades earlier, and told me it was some of the best work he'd ever seen me do. Better, he said, than any of the Phoenix spec houses he remembered from his childhood, houses built fast, under deadline, for buyers we'd sometimes never even meet. He asked me, sitting out on the terrace that first evening, whether I ever thought about what our life would have looked like if 2008 had never happened, if I'd simply retired at 55 the way we'd originally planned, comfortable in Arizona with that Sedona property we'd once been shopping for. I told him the honest truth, that I used to think about it constantly, in the early years especially, running that alternate timeline in my head like a wound I couldn't stop touching. But that somewhere over the last 2 years, laying tile in a house that was genuinely entirely mine, I'd mostly stopped doing that particular math, because the life it would have projected, however comfortable, wasn't actually this one, and I'd come to prefer this one, hard won as it was, over the easier version I used to grieve. I think about that comparison often now, sitting on our small terrace most evenings with Linda, looking out toward a Malikan that's been standing considerably longer than any subdivision I ever built in Phoenix. 24 years running a construction company taught me plenty about building fast, building profitably, building to a bank's exacting specifications and a buyer's tight timeline. It took losing all of that, and 18 hard years rebuilding from the wreckage, to finally build something slowly, carefully, for no reason beyond the simple fact that Linda and I intended to live inside it for whatever years we had left. The first house of my entire career that no bank could ever call the note on again. Linda joins me on that terrace most evenings now, the same specific hour I used to spend in 2009 doing anxious math on a legal pad in a rented apartment, and I've noticed I don't do that particular math anymore. Not out of avoidance, but because the numbers finally genuinely work. Modest, as they are compared to the plan 2008 originally erased. I still think about that October phone call sometimes, the careful, apologetic tone of a loan officer I'd known for over a decade. And I've come to understand it less as the ending it felt like at 50 and more, as the actual beginning of a considerably longer, harder, and ultimately more honest story than the easier one I'd originally planned. 18 years is a long time to wait for a retirement. I wouldn't recommend the particular route that got me here to anyone, and I don't say any of this as some tidy inspirational lesson about silver linings, because plenty of the people who lived through 2008 alongside me never fully rebuilt at all. But I'll tell you plainly, sitting in a house I built with my own 2 hands at 68, that the wait taught me things about resilience, about Linda, about my own son, that the original, easier plan almost certainly never would have. I'm Mark Peterson. Thank you for listening to Retired in Mexico.